Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
So the big row was over the Chancellor and what he may or may not have said about public sector pay. There are millions of people who presumably hope that if Labour makes it into power sometime soon, their pay packets will go up. But by how much and when? Labour also has questions to answer, and I'm joined now by the Shadow Chancellor, John McDonnell. Mr McDonnell, can I ask you, first of all, if you're a public sector worker and you're watching this programme, what can you expect from a Labour government?
We'll end the pay cap. We've made that clear. We've set aside £4 billion by the end of the Parliament on an annual basis to enable that to happen. We've looked at the Office of Budget Responsibility forecasting about how pay will rise, and it will certainly match inflation. And some review bodies, because it will be set by review bodies, I think will try and compensate for some of the losses over the last 7 years. Now, again, we're very clear. Unlike the government, which has set a pay cap the review bodies have to follow, it will be up to the review bodies to make recommendations that we will adhere to. But
you know that as Chancellor, you will actually write letters to the review bodies, setting the overall policy, the environment in which this happens.
But it will not
Don't you think that public sector workers deserve a little bit more than inflation, actually deserve a pay rise?
I think they do, but that will be up to the review bodies. What I won't be doing is what this government has done, is actually write to the review bodies and said, yes, you can review the pay, but you can only go up by 1%, which effectively means a pay cut for most people.
So to deal with that pay cut that goes back 5 or 7 years in some cases, you would raise public sector pay. What we don't know is whether would you raise it so it's in line with private sector pay, by and large?
What we try to do is say, look, these review bodies will have to look at all these factors, what's happening in the private sector, what's happening in the economy overall, and come with an honest judgment of what they think is best. What we can't do, let me just, if I can finish, what we can't do is what this government has done, is set an envelope which is unreal in relation to what people are earning.
But the real question is how much you're going to give these people.
Yes.
Because if you are going to match private sector pay, according to the OBR, that rises to about £9 billion a year. And that's money that's not budgeted for in your manifesto. Are you prepared to spend money beyond the manifesto to help public sector pay?
The figures are these. The government said a pay cap would save them £5 billion. So they think the cost of overcoming that pay cap is £1.25 billion a year. We put £4 billion in. Others have said higher than that, but I believe some of their figures are not accepting that. Some of that will be national insurance payments that are paid back to government as well. What we'll make sure is people get a fair pay rise. They will not have a pay cut as a result of inflation. And yes, if we can address some of the problems that have happened as a result of government policy, we're holding people back, we will, because one of the issues that we've got now is retention of staff.
All I'm saying is that is extra money beyond what you have budgeted for.
We've taken the OBR figures on pay rises, and that's why we calculate the £4 billion.
I beg your pardon. To be absolutely clear, to match inflation costs £4 billion, and you've budgeted for that. But to go beyond that and give people a pay rise would cost more. That is not money.
No, greatest respect. What we looked at was the OBR figures on their predictions of pay rises in the future. That's how we arrived at the £4 billion. The issue for us is how to ensure people get a proper pay, because at the moment we cannot retain staff. We've just lost 25% of the teachers recently recruited. Same with nurses.
We assess that if public pay setting is delegated to the pay review bodies by the Labour Party, as you suggest, the bodies would be likely to increase public sector pay in line with private sector pay. And our analysis implies an additional £9.2 billion a year, they say, the higher cost of employing public sector. That's the IFS.
The IFS have come out with that figure, and what we've said to them is actually we're following the OBR, the government-owned body that recommends to government what the figures should be. However, on the IFS figures, they've included things like national insurance payment by employers, which comes back to government anyway. They haven't looked at the tax that will come back as a result of that. So we think, well, the government has said 1.25 billion. IFS has said 9.2, which I think is overestimate. We've pitched ours at £4 billion based upon the Office of Budget Responsibility.
But that doesn't allow for a pay rise.
Yes, it does. The OBR figures...
You said that it's inflation.
The OBR figures are based upon their prediction of how wages will rise.
OK, let's move on to another issue. You'll have seen Angela Rayner sitting in that very chair last week, and she was talking about Jeremy Corbyn's promise to the electorate just a few days before the election that he was going to look at wiping out historic debt accumulated by students, and she said that would cost around 100 billion.
Yeah.
Is that a figure that you recognise?
Yes, it is about that. But the problem that we've got, the system's...
It's a heck of a lot of money.
It is a lot of money. The system's imploding, that's the problem. Half of the student debt, we now know, is not going to be paid back. So the system itself is falling apart. We've got to look at the system. And what we'll be doing is inviting people to come and advise us, and we'll try and do this, ensuring that we use economists from across the piece as well as educators.
But you will try and pay off that historic
debt?
Well,
we'll look at what we can do. It's a real ambition that we've got. But of course, we can only do...
It sounded like a promise at the time. That's the problem.
What Jeremy said is we recognise young people are coming out of college now with debts of £50,000. They cannot even think about buying a house or getting a property there. So we've got to tackle that. But the issue is the system's got to be tackled anyway because it's falling apart.
OK, so a very simple question. For students who have accumulated debt in this country, would a future Labour government help them out by at least dealing with some of that or not?
We're going to try to. We're going to try to. It's a real ambition of ours. I don't want to promise something we can't deliver. I want to be straight. Let me just...
It was promised just before, a few days before voting.
It wasn't a promise. What Jeremy said, we're going to try and tackle this issue. And one of the reasons we've got to tackle it is because the system itself is collapsing. And Andrew Adonis, the very minister...
OK, the reason I'm asking
Well, let me just finish this point, Andrew. Andrew Adonis, the very minister who introduced the system, wrote last week saying this system has got to be scrapped because it's not working.
Yes, so there's scrapping the system, but there's also, as it were, dealing with historic...
Of course there is.
And this felt like a promise. It was made in the New Musical Express, the NME, read by huge numbers of younger people.
And I'm not resigning.
Younger voters thought it was a promise. It sounds like it's a vague aspiration.
No, not at all. Let me just be clear. What we said in our manifesto, we'll scrap tuition fees. We'll scrap tuition fees. If we can help and deal with the debt, we certainly will do. And what we've said very, very clearly, because the system's collapsing, to be frank, whoever is in government has got to tackle this. Can I go back to this issue about low pay?
Please do.
Because you've seen what the Chancellor said in Cabinet about low pay, how public sector workers are overpaid. I was at Bart's Hospital yesterday with the cleaners who are now on strike. Why are they on strike? Because they asked for 30p an hour extra and we refused it. One of the cleaners gave me a pay slip. This is a pay slip copied to me. This woman, full-time worker, earns £297 a week. At the moment, median rent in London is nearly £1,500. To buy a house in London is £500,000. Ask Philip Hammond if he can live on that.
Oh, I certainly will. It's a question for him, not for me, but I certainly will. Let me return to the question, however, of overall Labour spending and read you something that the IFS has also said. Labour would raise spending to its highest level since the mid-1980s. That's on the basis of your manifesto. And to record levels in peacetime. The tax burden would increase to its highest level since 1949. That is why a lot of people looked at you and Jeremy Corbyn. Many voted for you, but many others flinched.
Where is that tax burden falling? 95% of the people, income earners in this country, taxpayers, will not have any increase in income tax or VAT or national insurance. We're asking two groups to pay a bit more. The top 5% of earners, but also the corporations. Why am I saying that? Because the corporations have had their taxes cut by this government on a scale we've never seen before in our history. And as a result of that, we're not getting the business investment. They're sitting on £580 billion worth of earned income not being invested. We believe that it is a political choice. We believe the political choice should be those that are the richest, and the corporations should pay a bit more. Why am I saying that?
Well,
let me just say the Resolution Foundation report this week said after the recession 10 years ago, the 1%, the richest in our country now, have recovered. The 99% are still suffering. Even down to the figures where, one of the figures of 42%. So nearly half of the people in this country can't afford a holiday this year. That's scandalous.
Well, let me ask you about the business side, though, the corporation tax, because we are on the edge of these Brexit negotiations. Do you think that leaving the customs union would be disastrous for British business?
Well, let me just say about the corporation tax increase. We'll still be the lowest of the developed countries. I believe we have to try and maintain the benefits of the customs union, and that's one of the issues we've got to negotiate.
What does that mean? Does it mean staying inside or leaving?
Keep all the options open. Keep all the options open.
So under Labour, we could stay inside the customs union?
We're keeping all the options open. We're concentrating on the objectives rather than the structures, and that seems to have a resonance across Europe at the moment.
What about the transitional arrangements? Because a lot of businesses want us to effectively stay inside the EU for maybe 4 or 5 years ahead so that they can plan for the exit.
Most of the businesses I've been talking to are saying at least we need a 2-year transitional period. There might be different transitional periods for different sectors, but everyone realises there has to be a transitional period. And that's what we're pressing the government on now.
And when it comes to what happens in the House of Commons, I mean, you want the Conservatives to collapse and to have a general election soon, but there's no necessary sign of that. They could carry on for 5 years. So inside the House of Commons, you can exercise some pressure as the opposition parties. Do you use that to get a different kind of Brexit?
The problem that we've got is, as you've seen from this week, the Conservative cabinet are fighting like rats in a sack. The Europeans want to know what our direction is. What is our negotiating position? There's a different negotiating position virtually every day coming out of this government's cabinet. It's falling apart. In the interest of the country, my view is that they should stand down and let us form a government so that we can negotiate a Brexit in the interest of our country, protecting jobs and the economy. If they don't do that in the House of Commons, we'll try and get a majority of MPs to vote for a sensible Brexit.
One other thing I must ask you about. Do you regret saying that the people who died in Grenfell Tower were killed by political murder?
No, I don't regret that. I was extremely angry with what went on. And I'm a West London MP. This site is not far from me. Political decisions were made which resulted in the deaths of these people. That's a scandal. But
murder means a specific thing. Murder means a volition to actually kill another human being, intentional killing.
There's a long history in this country of the concept of social murder, where decisions are made with no regard to the consequences of that, and as a result of that, people have suffered. That's what's happened here, and I'm angry about it.
You regard it as murder?
I believe social murder has occurred in this instance, and I believe that people should be held accountable.
And so who are the murderers?
I think there's been a consequence of political decisions over years that have not addressed the housing crisis that we've had, that have cut back on local government, so proper inspections have not made, cut back 11,000 firefighters, jobs been cut as well, even the investment in aerial ladders and things like that in our country.
So the politicians who sanctioned the cuts are murderers?
I believe the politicians have to be held to account. I remain angry at how many people have lost their lives as a result of political decisions that have been made over years. I was one of the... I've set up...
To be absolutely clear, these decisions happened under Labour and Tory governments over the years.
I set up the Fire Brigades Union Parliamentary Group. Way back in 2004, I raised the issue of sprinklers. All through this last 7 years in particular, I've been going along with ministers on behalf of the FBU to say stop cutting firefighter jobs, stop undermining national standards. No one was listening at that point in time.
Very, very strong word to use, but murderers is still how you regard the politicians who took those decisions.
I do not resile from what I've said, and I remain angry at the loss of life that has taken place not far away from my constituency.
John McDonnell, thank you very much for talking to us. Now then, talking of people who are getting it from all sides, according to repeated, if anonymous, cabinet sources overnight, the Chancellor offended some of his own colleagues at the week's political cabinet meeting by saying that public sector workers were overpaid. Now, this may be simply malicious. There's a lot of cabinet-level malice in today's papers, but I'm joined now by the man himself to clear it up. Did you say it?
Andrew, I'm not going to talk about what was or wasn't said in a cabinet meeting, and it's easy to quote a phrase out of context, but I'm very happy to talk about the substantive issue.
Okay. Well,
public sector pay raced ahead of private sector pay after the crash in 2008-9, and taking public sector pay before pension contributions, that gap has now closed. Public and private sector pay on average are around about the same level, but when you take into account the very generous contributions that public sector employers have to pay in for their workers' pensions, their very generous pensions, they are still about 10% ahead. And I don't for a moment deny that there are areas in the public service where recruitment and retention is becoming an issue, that there are areas of the country where public sector wages and private sector wages are getting out of kilter in the other direction. And we have to look at these things and we have to discuss them. But it's important that we discuss them on the basis of the facts, not rhetoric from the Labour Party or the trade unions.
Your own department denied that you had used the word overpaid. Can I ask you directly, do you think that public sector workers in this country are, in general, overpaid?
So this is a relative question. This is about the relationship between public and private sector pay. And it is a simple fact, independent figures show this, that public sector workers, on average, are paid about 10% more than private sector workers.
So
and we
you
have
think
to bear that in mind.
relative to private sector workers, are they overpaid?
Relative to private sector workers, they are paid about a 10% premium. Now, I know this includes pension contribution. You can't eat your pension. You can't feed your kids with your pension contribution. So I understand that. I understand all the issues that public sector workers are facing.
Think of that cleaner that John McDonnell described just now. I've got her pay slip here. It's a weekly pay slip. £297 is what she takes home. Do you think that's overpaid?
No, of course it's not overpaid. And look,
that's very hard to live on that.
John McDonnell needs to remember that it was a Conservative government that introduced the national living wage. And he also should know that the only way we can sustainably increase pay... Low pay is not just an issue in the public sector, it's an issue in the private sector as well. Millions of workers on really relatively low pay. The only way we can address that, the only way we can create the high-wage economy that we want to have sustainably is to increase productivity, to get our public finances into good order. There isn't a shortcut. There isn't a free lunch.
You think in relative terms public sector workers are overpaid, and when you write those letters to the pay review bodies in due course, it will be more pretty tough messages. Those people watching who are public sector workers should expect more austerity, more of the pay cap, more of the going backwards in terms of their actual pay.
Well, our policy on public sector pay hasn't changed. We've sought to be fair to public sector workers, but also fair to the taxpayers.
They've had a 7-year freeze.
Yeah, they've had a 7-year, not a freeze, but they've had 7 years.
Inflation's gone back. Most of them have gone backwards.
7 years of pay restraint. But let's also be clear about this. Teachers, for example, in 2015-16 had a 3.3% pay increase. NHS staff last year, about over half of them had a pay increase averaging just over 3%. So it isn't the same picture across the board. But look, our position is that we have to be fair to public sector workers, we have to look at recruitment and retention problems, we have to be fair to taxpayers, and we have to try to protect jobs in the public sector. Those are the bits of the equation that we have to juggle. We do keep this under constant review, and I think the fact that, as is now apparently well known, the Cabinet's been discussing this issue sends a clear signal that we do understand the concern both of public sector workers and of the wider public.
I think most people watching this interview will conclude that you did say that they were overpaid.
Well, I've told you, I'm not going to talk about what comes out of a private Cabinet
meeting. 5 of your colleagues have talked
about it. They shouldn't have done, frankly, because Cabinet meetings are supposed to be a private space in which we have a serious discussion. I'm the Chancellor. You would expect me to put any discussion about public sector pay in the context of the fiscal and economic situation that we face. Others who represent spending departments employing large numbers of public sector workers will bring their experience and their realities to the table. And that's how we have a discussion and how we eventually reach decisions.
And this morning they have gone for you publicly, all over the papers. Are you angry about that?
Well, look, I don't know who said what. I do know, I think David Lidington, my colleague David Lidington, who appeared on your show last week, was probably spot on the money when he said we're in the middle of the silly summer season with lots of warm Prosecco and
cold
late
Paul
night,
Roger, I think,
late night. Well, it may have been, I wasn't there, it may have been cold Paul Roger, but lots of parties going on, lots of tittle-tattle, lots of gossip. We've got a summer recess coming up. The government
and they should build up now.
The government has. Well, I do think on many fronts it would be helpful if my colleagues, all of us, focused on the job in hand. This government, as Ian Duncan Smith said earlier, is facing a ticking clock over the Brexit negotiations. David Davis will be going tomorrow to Brussels to start the next round of negotiations. We have a very crucial job to do here in getting a Brexit deal which protects jobs, prosperity, and British businesses, and that's what we should be focused on.
But they're after you in particular. Can I ask, did you say that trains are now so easy to drive these days that even women could do it?
No, I didn't, and I wouldn't say anything like that. But what I have said, and I was Transport Secretary...
Did the Prime Minister say, I'm going to take your shovel away from you?
Again, I'm not going to get into what was or wasn't said in a Cabinet meeting, but I've got 2 daughters in their early 20s, both high achievers. I don't think like that. I wouldn't make a remark like that. But what I would say is this, and I've been saying this since I was Transport Secretary in 2010-11, it is a disgrace that 95% of train drivers are men. There is no reason at all why that workforce shouldn't be more gender balanced, except that the unions control the recruitment and training process. And in the context of a discussion about industrial relations on the railways, I think it's very important to focus on that control that the unions have over the training process.
So why are people going for you in today's papers? Is there now a fight for the leadership of the Conservative Party underway in Cabinet?
Well, I certainly hope not. And
it appears to be the case.
If there is, I'm no part of it. I think my colleagues should focus on the job that we've been elected to do. This government will be a stable government because people understand that there is a crucial job that needs to be done. They'll support us while we get on with that job, but they won't indulge us if we start turning our attentions elsewhere. If you want my opinion, some of the noise is generated by people who are not happy with the agenda that I have, over the last few weeks, tried to advance of ensuring that we achieve a Brexit which is focused on protecting our economy, protecting our jobs, and making sure that we can have continued rising living standards in the future.
So these are hardcore Brexiteers who want a hard Brexit and a fast Brexit, attacking you for that reason?
Well, you'll have to ask Tim Shipman, James Forsyth, who it is. I don't know who their sources are.
I think you can guess. Can I turn to the economy and ask you about the recent OBR report, which was quite worrying to a lot of people? We looked at it and said the economy is in a pretty poor condition.
The Fiscal Risks Report.
Fiscal Risks Report.
So this was a report that we asked the OBR to produce, bringing us into line with IMF guidance and one or two of the most advanced economies in the world in terms of fiscal transparency, to look at our position and tell us where the future risks are in our economy. And I think it's a very good exercise, and I very much appreciate the report that they've produced. And what it warns, which is particularly germane to the discussion we've just been having, is that the levels of debt we have in this country and the level of deficit we're still running means that we would be vulnerable to any future shock. So unlike 2008, we would not have the capacity. So we can't
borrow more.
That's simply the point. We would not have the capacity for government to intervene and protect the economy as it did in 2008-9 because our level of debt and our level of deficit is too high.
Can I continue asking you about Brexit in particular? Because there's reports again in today's papers about Paris, perhaps not surprisingly, trying to steal the trade of the City of London. There's been reports of quite a sharp fall in levels of investment, particularly in the British car industry, heading towards a 75% fall in investment in the British car industry. You're getting all these businessmen coming to you, getting all these reports on your table. Are you worried about the state of the economy as we go into these Brexit negotiations? Is the slowdown happening?
Well, I think it's absolutely clear that businesses where they have discretion over investment, where they can hold off, are doing so. And you can understand why. They're waiting for more clarity about what the future relationship with Europe will look like. And the way to get the economy moving, the way to restore business confidence and then consumer confidence is to give as much clarity as possible, as early as possible, which is why I have been talking over the last 4 or 5 weeks about the importance of a transition arrangement. And I believe the great majority of my colleagues now recognise that that is the right and sensible way to go, both in UK and in the European Union.
And this could go on for 3 or 4 years, a transitional arrangement. That's what a lot of business wants.
Well, I'm not going to speculate on the length of it. It needs to, in my view, it needs to be a defined period. We've got to do this in a way that meets the concerns and requirements of both people who want a softer version of Brexit and those who campaigned hard to leave the European Union. I think most people are willing to accept a transition so long as it's of a limited duration in order to avoid a hard landing.
But this would be a number of years during which, in effect, we'd still be members of the single market, in effect, we'd still be paying in effect, we'd still be coming under the ECJ.
No, well, we would not be members of the single market because we would leave the single market when we left the European Union on the 29th of March 2019. That is fixed. I don't think anybody's suggesting that we should change that. And look, how long should a transition period be? I think that's a technical question. It depends how long we need to put in place new customs systems, new migration systems. These things can't be magicked up overnight. And there is a piece of work going on inside government now to look at how long it will take to build the infrastructure, hire the people, put in place the IT systems and so on.
Have you any idea about how long we're talking about?
Well, I think we're not going to be talking a couple of months. I think we are going to be talking a couple of years.
All right. What we do know for sure at the moment is that Mr. Barnier and the European team desperately want to sort out the money before anything else happens. You're the man in charge of the money. Have you budgeted for an exit fee for the EU?
Well, we don't have a sum of money included specifically for that purpose, but our current public finances include our contributions to the European Union. And what the OBR has done, if you read its last report looking forward, is assumed that although those monies might be used for different purposes, on domestic programmes, on continuing to contribute perhaps to some European programmes, broadly speaking, the amount of money will remain the same. So they haven't budgeted a bonus from leaving the European Union, but nor have they budgeted a cost.
But do you accept, because there was a statement in the House of Lords that appeared to suggest this, that we have ongoing obligations to the EU which are financial, which we must settle early in the negotiating period?
Well, we are discussing precisely that question this week in Brussels with the European Union, and what we've said repeatedly is that we are a country that always honours its obligations, as we expect others to honour their obligations towards us. And if there is any amount that is due, when it's been properly quantified and audited, of course we'll deal with it.
So they shouldn't just go whistle for it then?
We're not a country that walks away from our debts. Well, look, if you're referring to the comment that Boris Johnson made earlier in the week, but Boris was talking specifically about this fanciful 100 billion figure that's been bandied about by some in Brussels.
Well, a lot of people are talking about 40 billion.
That is a ridiculous figure. It's
Okay,
plucked
is
out
40
of thin
billion
air.
a ridiculous
There is
figure?
no substance to it.
Is
Look,
40 billion a ridiculous figure?
I'm not going to get into a process of talking about specific figures when David Davis is about to open a negotiation in Brussels tomorrow. That would totally undermine his position, and I'm not going to do it.
Is it possible for this government to negotiate a proper Brexit when the cabinet is so divided over the issue?
Well, this is a sort of media line.
I was just picking up what you were saying, that people are going for you because they don't like the kind of Brexit that you want.
But I think the Cabinet is coming much closer together on issues like transition, for example. 5 weeks ago, the idea of a transition period was quite a new concept. I think now you'd find that pretty much everybody around the Cabinet table accepts that there will be some kind of transition. We're into a real process now with the start of negotiations, and I think you'll find the Cabinet rallying around a position that maximises our negotiating leverage and gets the best possible deal for Britain.
Is it almost as simple as if you and David Davis can agree the proposed terms of Brexit, you can sell that to the Conservative Party?
Well, David and I work very closely together, and we're both looking to get the best possible deal for Britain. And we both know that continued growth in the economy is actually the measure by which people will judge their political leaders. They can talk about a lot of other things, but in the end, it'll be about whether they see their incomes rising, their standard of living rising, their jobs being secure. And that's our objective, and certainly we try to work together to agree on these things.
Back in 2010, you warned that a Labour government could rise the national debt to £1.5 trillion. What is it now?
It's 1.7 trillion, as you very well know, Andrew.
You've done worse.
Look, because...
That is a big failure, isn't it?
Well, there were choices, weren't there, about how fast we wanted to do deficit reduction, how much we wanted to impose on the economy to do that. We could have done it more quickly, as some countries in the European Union have done, at the price of soaring unemployment.
And we've got a weaker economy now than
in this
before the
country
crash.
to protect jobs as a priority, and we've done brilliantly well, creating 3.4 million new jobs since 2010.
One very last, final quick question. You'll have heard John McDonnell suggesting that the people who died in Grenfell Tower were the victims of political murder. How do you respond to that?
It's a disgraceful suggestion, in line with many other things John McDonnell said over the years. There is absolutely not a shred of evidence to support that. It was a terrible tragedy, but of course we must wait for the outcome of the public inquiry to understand exactly what happened and to learn the lessons from it, and we will learn the lessons.
Philip Hammond, thank you very much indeed.
I've been getting away with it all.